In a real forest, you are never really alone. This was one of my father's favorite sayings. Whenever he, my brother and I would go on one of our camping trips, usually to some spot in the mountains, up through the pines, he would always remind us of it, usually just as it began to grow dark. What he meant by it was that in the forest, there is always movement, always presence. Even in those moments of hush, when everything seems to become still, and even the wind has decided to rest, still, somewhere, within the tangles of branches, the bracken and leaves, there are eyes, silently watching. When he said it, he was referring to the animals, to the roosting birds on branches and in nests, to thick furred things that flitted and scurried through fallen leaves, pausing only to observe, even at night, when the only light was the one thrown up by the fire. Those eyes, he said, would be there, watching. To him it was a comfort. To my brother and I, it was creepy. For though we knew what he meant, that he was referring to the creatures, and celebrating the fact we were closer to nature, our fertile childhood imaginations would fix on those words and fasten them to other darker things. Things that would watch not from their hovels, their branches or their holes, but from the black spaces between the trees. For us that phrase conjured strange, awful forms, things with teeth that would wait and watch from the dark, not out of simple, dumb curiosity, but because they were surveying, looking for an opportunity. We'd never say this to Dad, or even to each other until years later. At the time, we'd put on a brave face, assured that as long as Dad was there and the fire was burning, we were safe. Our fears, the ones that came creeping to join us in our tents, to wait with us after lights out and force us to listen for every snap of a twig and rustle of bush, those were private fears. After Dad died and my brother and I decided to continue the tradition and go out camping together, we would laugh about that phrase. How, though neither of us mentioned it, it used to scare us stupid. You're never really alone. Still, by the time we admitted that, we were grown men, drinking beers instead of cocoa around the campfire and unafraid of snapping twigs. Or at least we were, until that night last fall. Since then, we've thought of the woods differently, and in fact, we've never been back. We'd set out around 1 p.m, knowing it was going to be a long climb to the spot where we hoped to camp, deep in the woods and deliberately isolated from anyone else. We pitched our tents around 4 p.m. and had a decent fire going at 5, on which we cooked the things we'd brought, drank some beers, and talked in the relaxed, honest way that brothers will. We raised a toast, as we always did, to Dad, and around midnight, as the night was growing increasingly cold, decided it was time to turn in. Unlike when I was a kid, when I'd lie awake listening for sounds in the dark, as an adult, I tended to nod off quickly in the woods. Maybe because of the long walk to get there, because of the mountain air, or because I had a really good sleeping bag, but for whatever reason I was out like a light. Until, that is, I was rudely awoken. The sound was anything but subtle. It was not the rustling leaves and far-off snap of twig that haunts most camping horror stories. This was a crash, a loud eruption of sound that came from somewhere around 10 feet back into the tree line. Our camp was set up in an almost circular clearing on some hard, compacted ground that the roots seemed to have coiled around. We were surrounded on all sides by trees, and in front of us was the trail that led up and through the mountains. When we heard the commotion, a dull thunk accompanied by an orchestra of fractured branches, as if something large had fallen out a tree, landed in a thorn bush, and was thrashing to get out. Our first thought was a bear. Unzipping the tent with one hand, David had already reached for his rifle with the other, and as he stepped cautiously out, I was inches behind him with my own weapon in hand. For almost 5 minutes we stared in silence into a wall of black. Nothing moved. Before us, the dying embers of the fire swelled with a pale orange glow, lighting only the bottom of the few closest trees. Beyond that, the only light came from the moon, which, although it cast silver highlights on our chairs and our gear, seemed to stop dead at the tree line, as if it too was fearful of going any further. Still we waited, straining our ears to pick up even the faintest hint of a sound. Nothing. So we returned to the tent. "Probably deadwood falling somewhere further back," said David. "Some ancient limb that had snapped off and fallen into the brush below. If there was something big out there," he explained, "it wouldn't have just stood still whilst we waited all that time." we would either have seen or heard it as it moved. So we crawled back into our sleeping bags, now so cold they felt almost damp, and attempted to sleep. It was around an hour later that the next sounds came. This time not the thud and crash of something large, but a softer, rustling hiss. At first I assumed it was just the wind disturbing the leaves, but then I heard them. Voices. I sat bolt upright and reached out for David, pressing my finger to my lips to hush him, though he probably couldn't see me in the dark. For a few moments we both sat there, still silent inside the tent listening. At first there was nothing. Then, somewhere to the right of the tent, whispers, so low and faint, they seemed to curl and float up from the ground like mist. And yet, they were there. Voices. David asked if it was the wind, yet even then he could hear, within the faint rustling, the sibilant clicks and harder edges of sounds formed by lips. These were words. David reached toward the zipper. If there was someone in our camp, trying not to disturb us or to raid our gear, then they were about to get quite the surprise. Stepping out of the tent, this time with me leading, we again took our rifles. No sooner had I stepped out than the sound changed. The whispering that had wound itself around our tents scattered outward in a frantic, skittering rush of tiny footsteps. I looked around me, trying to see where the sound was coming from, but the sheer number of them, the quick, soft pattern of dozens of tiny feet, made it difficult to follow any one sound, or make it out distinctly. As David joined me outside, I told him what I'd heard. "Rats?" he mouthed. "Or rabbits?" I could not really mouth to him my counter-argument that rats and rabbits don't speak, and what I had heard, what had initially woken me, was undoubtedly speech. Standing in silence for the second time that night, we again cautiously listened. Now there was no rustling, no speaking, and no movement. I gestured toward David's hip, encouraging him to shine his flashlight. We hadn't used it earlier, because we had suspected a large animal and didn't want to startle it. But these sounds were undoubtedly coming from something small. Reaching to his belt, David unhooked the flashlight and shone it toward the tree line. What we saw there was enough to persuade us never to camp in the forest again. Against the sea of dark that hung like a blanket, just beyond the reach of the torch, the forest showed us some of its secrets. Eyes. Scores of them, around 30 or 40 inches from the ground. The sheen or their lenses reflecting back from the torchlight as they watched. For a second I wondered if David might have been right, that perhaps they were rats or some other species of rodent. By the height didn't seem right. Even on hind legs a rat should not be that high up from the ground. Not to mention the fact that whatever these eyes belonged to, they were all standing, stock still and watching, waiting. As David swept the torch from left to right, more and more tiny eyes were revealed, glistening like tiny emeralds, of a greenish color and around the size of a quarter. They were all around. "I don't like this," said David, nervously, as I said I agreed, and from somewhere further back, beyond the torchlight and the eyes, the voices started again, small, chattering whispers that made me think of those tiny parrots people keep and train to speak. Then all at once they spoke together.
"I don't like this,"
they repeated in chorus. David gripped my arm firmly. Moving the torchlight back to the fire, our camping chairs, and toward the tent, he seemed to be searching, looking to see if any of these things, whatever they were, had ventured out. Close to us, what he found instead were footprints, hundreds and hundreds etched in the dust. Tiny footprints, each of no more than 2 inches long, and yet perfectly formed like the barefooted print of a baby. Seeing that, Davis cocked his rifle, aimed the barrel up to the sky, and fired. There was a thunderous bang and a great commotion within the bushes as the eyes disappeared, presumably retreating. Terrified and still aiming our guns towards the trees, we retook our seats in the camping chairs and watched the edge of the forest until the sun eventually rose. I've never packed up as quickly as I did that morning, and our descent down the mountain probably broke some kind of record. Neither of us has ever come closer to explaining what we saw that night. Around 6 months later, however, David sent me a clipping from a local newspaper. The story was about a professor at a university in the city who had uncovered some unusual specimens from an area close to where we had been camped. According to this professor, he had studied the partial remains of several deer carcasses, all of which showed signs of having been killed and eaten by predators. What had gotten this professor particularly excited, however, was the mysterious identity of these predators. According to him, the markings he found on the bones resembled nothing so much as those of piranhas. Hundreds, he wrote, of tiny mouths, each with razor teeth, had stripped the deer's carcass clean. What's more, when the bite signature was measured, it revealed a shape which, though many times smaller, closely resembled the pattern of tiny human teeth. Of course, few within the academic community took his findings seriously, but I certainly did. I thought as I read of the first crash we'd heard that night, of how it could have been an animal taken down and furiously torn apart. I thought too of what might have happened had the predators not already fed before they stumbled across our camp. Most all, though, I thought of my father's words and of how in a real forest you are never really alone.